What would a third world war actually leave behind? The opening imagines a catastrophe beyond ordinary ideas of battle. Death, hunger, lost freedom, and then something worse, the collapse of civilization itself. Internet networks fail. Money loses its function. Bodies lie unburied while millions face hunger. Animals die, crops become unsafe, and the air itself seems poison. Fires, tsunamis, and repeated earthquakes deepen the sense of a world no longer recognizable. The sky turns dark, sunlight disappears for years, and survivors crowd into bunkers with whatever food and water remain. This apocalyptic picture leads to the warning attached to Albert Einstein. 2 years after World War II, he was presented as saying that a third world war could push humanity back toward the Stone Age. The image is simple because the destruction behind it is not. If nuclear war erased the systems that make modern life possible, the survivors might inherit a civilization reversed rather than advanced. That is why the source returns to Einstein at the end. After tracing nuclear danger across decades, it argues that a third world war could devastate the planet and everything living on it. In that framing, sticks and stones are not a joke. They are the symbol of a world that has survived modern weapons only by losing the modern world itself. To understand why Einstein's warning carried such weight, the story returns to the world that produced it. The source places his 1947 warning directly after World War II, and inside the new fear created by nuclear weapons. It connects that fear to Einstein's scientific legacy, especially the theory of relativity and the equation associated with atomic energy. The narration then turns to the letter Einstein sent to President Roosevelt and the sequence that followed. Roosevelt formed an advisory committee on uranium, and the effort developed into the Manhattan Project, a scientific program led by figures including Oppenheimer. From that project came the atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The source is careful to say that Einstein did not directly work on the Manhattan Project or build nuclear weapons, but it presents his scientific work and his letter to Roosevelt as part of the chain that made the atomic age possible. That connection becomes the emotional center of the warning. Einstein is portrayed as deeply troubled by the destructive consequences attached to ideas that had begun as physics. In a 1947 interview cited by the narration, he said that if he had known Germany would fail to develop an atomic bomb, he would not have acted. A magazine cover from July 1946 is also described, showing Einstein, the formula E.J. McVeigh, and the image of an atomic explosion. The symbolism is unmistakable. Science and destruction had become visually inseparable. Then comes the conversation that gave the warning its most memorable form. A March 1947 report described Einstein speaking with fellow scientists at a dinner. He was asked what new weapons might be used in World War III. At first, the question left him silent. After several minutes, he answered that he did not know what weapons would be used in the Third World War, but he had no doubt about the weapons of the Fourth. When asked what those would be, the answer was sticks and stones. The logic was brutal. If a Third World War became nuclear, the destruction could be so complete that the next survivors would have little technology left to fight with. For people raised in periods of peace, that idea can feel abstract. Einstein had lived through 2 world wars and had seen how technology could magnify destruction. In the source's telling, that experience is what turned his warning from a clever quotation into a forecast of civilization moving backward. The warning only matters if the world repeatedly comes close to the kind of conflict it describes. The source therefore moves from Einstein's post-war fear into a series of crises after World War II. It argues that nuclear powers did not simply inherit destructive weapons. They also inherited repeated moments in which rivalry could have widened into another world war. The first example is the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. North Korea was backed by the Soviet side of the Cold War, while South Korea was supported by the United States. Because the confrontation arrived just as the rivalry between the two superpowers was hardening, the Korean Peninsula became more than a regional battlefield. It risked bringing the two great blocs into direct collision. The fighting eventually ended in an armistice and a demilitarized zone, leaving Korea divided but avoiding a direct Soviet-American war. The second example is far more intimate and far more nuclear: the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union confronted each other under the threat of nuclear escalation. The source focuses on one Soviet submarine, B-59, armed with a nuclear torpedo. On October 27th, American naval forces in the Caribbean used depth charges in an effort to force the submarine to surface. Inside B-59, Captain Valentin Savitsky believed the boat was under dangerous pressure and sought permission to launch the nuclear torpedo. The Soviet rules described in the narration required the agreement of 3 senior officers. Savitsky supported launch. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov was also part of the decision. The third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, opposed firing. That disagreement became decisive. Arkhipov argued against starting a nuclear conflict and also pointed to the submarine's deteriorating condition. The batteries were running low and the cooling system had been damaged by the shock of the depth charges. Eventually, the others accepted the decision to surface instead of launching. In the source's account, that single refusal helped keep the confrontation from becoming a nuclear exchange. The episode later came to be remembered as one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War, and one of the most dangerous moments for humanity. A 2002 recollection cited in the narration goes further, describing Arkhipov as the officer who saved the world. The larger Cuban crisis followed the same terrifying logic. American intelligence had found Soviet missiles in Cuba. Tension rose for nearly 2 weeks. Each side faced the possibility that another move could trigger destruction neither could control. The crisis eventually cooled because both sides stepped away from the nuclear edge. But by then the lesson was clear. Einstein's warning did not require a planned apocalypse. It could begin with pressure, fear, misreading, and a decision made inside a confined room by people who had only minutes to choose. The next flashpoint came in South Asia. In December 1971, Pakistan attacked 11 Indian Air Force bases, beginning a war that lasted 13 days and grew out of the struggle for independence in East Pakistan, the territory that became Bangladesh. The regional war quickly carried a wider Cold War danger. India had a friendship and cooperation agreement with the Soviet Union, while Pakistan received support from the United States through its existing alliance relationships. At first, the two superpowers mainly provided political and military support from a distance in. But as Pakistan's position in the East weakened and the possibility of a major Indian move against West Pakistan grew, outside military involvement escalated. President Richard Nixon sent Task Force 74 from the United States 7th Fleet toward the Bay of Bengal. Britain also sent the carrier HMS Eagle. The Soviet Union responded by deploying destroyer and cruiser groups into the Indian Ocean. Suddenly, forces connected to both blocs were operating in the same broader theater, close enough that a regional war could have pulled them toward direct confrontation. The source stresses how little would have been required for the crisis to widen. Each side's forces were effectively waiting on decisions from national leaders. On December 10th, Nixon contacted Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev through the special hotline created after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The message urged Moscow to restrain India and warned that the consequences of further escalation could not be separated from Soviet responsibility. 3 days later, the Kremlin replied that it would wait for updated information from East Pakistan and indicate that it did not fully support an Indian invasion of West Pakistan. The tension between Washington and Moscow eased. On December 16th, Pakistani forces in the east surrendered, and the state of Bangladesh emerged. The war ended without a direct clash between the superpowers, but the source treats those days as another moment when a local conflict sat dangerously close to a global one. Then only 2 years later, the Yom Kippur War created another confrontation. The war began on October 6, 1973, when Arab states attacked Israel, and continued until October 25. Again, the United States and Soviet Union backed opposing sides. The American Sixth Fleet supported Israel, while the Soviet Mediterranean forces supported the Arab states. On October 24th, the two naval forces were positioned only hundreds of miles apart. The United States raised its defense condition from DEFCON 4 to DEFCON 3. According to material cited in the narration, commanders on both sides had prepared plans for what would happen if naval combat began. The Soviet side, lacking comparable air power, considered concentrating missiles, guns, torpedoes, and rockets against American aircraft carriers before those carriers could launch their aircraft. The American side was instructed to avoid maneuvers that Moscow or the Arab states could interpret as direct intervention. The turning point came when Egypt accepted an American proposal and did not seek direct Soviet personnel support. Moscow also stepped back. The United States lowered its alert level again, and the confrontation cooled after a ceasefire and United Nations Security Council Resolution 339. Once more, the pattern was not a deliberate march toward world war. It was a regional conflict, superpower commitments, military forces moving closer, and leaders trying to stop the final step before those forces met. The Cold War ended, but the pattern did not disappear. In June 1999, one day after the Kosovo War was ended through the Kumanovo Agreement, Russian forces moved into Pristina International Airport before NATO peacekeepers arrived. The source describes a Russian force of about 30 armored vehicles and 250 troops under Major General Viktor Zavarzin. NATO's American commander, General Wesley Clark, responded by sending reconnaissance and special units toward the airport. British General Mike Jackson led the force on the ground. Clark saw that the Russian position was smaller and lacked air support, and he ordered measures intended to isolate the Russians. Jackson recognized the danger in turning that pressure into a firefight. A clash at the airport could have created a new confrontation between Russia and NATO on the morning after another war had supposedly ended. The crisis was eventually diffused through a new agreement in early July 1999. Russian troops were allowed to remain in Kosovo as peacekeepers alongside NATO, but not under NATO command. The next example came more than 2 decades later. On January 3, 2020, an American drone strike in Baghdad killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, a senior military figure deeply respected in Iran. The source describes Iran raising a red flag as a symbol of retaliation. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and President Hassan Rouhani promised a military response rather than a purely diplomatic one. President Donald Trump answered with a threat that the United States could strike 52 important Iranian sites if Iran attacked. The exchange created global anxiety, and the phrase World War III spread rapidly across social media, along with memes about the possibility of a larger conflict. Then came the Russian invasion of Ukraine, beginning on February 24, 2022. The narration presents the war as another example of the power held by a nuclear-armed state. It argues that Vladimir Putin used nuclear rhetoric alongside Russia's national security justification for the invasion. The source specifically mentions the RS-28 Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile, describing it as able to carry nuclear warheads and reach targets as far as 18,000 kilometers away. It also turns to the Tsar Bomba, described in the narration as a 100 megaton weapon with an explosive power claimed to be about 3,800 times that of the little boy bomb used on Hiroshima. Another claim cited in the source as such a weapon could devastate London and kill nearly 6 million people. The narration also cites Russian parliamentary defense figure Andrei Gurulov threatening American and British satellites and naming London as a possible nuclear target. These threats were met by strong responses from the United States, Britain, and other NATO members. For the source, the larger danger is the return of a polarized geopolitical structure. The United States and European states on one side, Russia and China on the other. It compares that polarization to the Cold War and warns that failed diplomacy could again put nuclear weapons into the logic of confrontation. The source then widens the frame from specific crises to the size of the nuclear arsenal itself. It says that the world held roughly 70,300 nuclear warheads in 1986, while by early 2023, the estimated number had fallen to around 12,500. It lists 11 states in its accounting and says Russia held about 5,089 warheads, followed by the United States with about 5,224. Together, it says, those two countries accounted for roughly 89% of the global total. The narration also notes that some American nuclear weapons are stationed in countries including Turkey, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and Belgium. At the same time, it warns that exact national stockpiles are secret, so published estimates carry uncertainty. Finally, the source points to rising tensions in several regions. It describes Israel's actions in Palestine as genocide, notes worsening tensions between China and Taiwan, and mentions renewed confrontation between North and South Korea. Its conclusion is not that a third world war is inevitable. It is that the number of possible triggers makes the idea harder to dismiss. The spark could come from the Middle East, the Korean Peninsula, or another contested sea. That leads directly to the question Einstein's warning forces onto the story. If the Third World War actually begins, what survives it? The source answers that question by imagining collapse in layers. The first layer is political trust. A third world war would deepen suspicion among powerful states, break diplomatic relationships, and make peaceful settlement harder at precisely the moment it was most necessary. The next layer is the economy. Financial markets could fall into chaos, international trade could be interrupted, and even stable economies could buckle as governments redirected resources toward war and geopolitical competition. Trade agreements could collapse. Comprehensive sanctions could spread. Global supply chains could be cut by restrictions imposed across borders. Communications networks and critical infrastructure could become military targets. Then the damage would move from states and markets to ordinary people. Millions living in conflict zones could be forced from their homes. Refugees would cross borders seeking safety, and neighboring countries could struggle to absorb the numbers arriving. As fighting spread through agricultural regions, farmland could be damaged, and trade could stop. Food supplies would shrink, stocks would become difficult to replace, and hunger would follow. But the most destructive possibility, in Einstein's warning, is nuclear use. A single nuclear detonation could destroy a wide area and become part of a disaster far larger than the immediate blast zone. The narration describes electromagnetic effects capable of disabling electrical systems, potentially knocking out power across an entire country. It then turns to the human cost. Enormous immediate death, severe burns, radiation injuries, and illnesses caused by exposure. Hospitals and medical systems could collapse under the same attack that creates the people needing treatment. Beyond the first days lies the longer environmental disaster. The source cites atmospheric scientist Paul Crutzen, and a 1982 paper describing the enormous smoke clouds that nuclear war could produce. Radioactive material would spread dangerous particles through the atmosphere. The result, as presented here, could include acid rain, falling global temperatures, and radioactive contamination of soil, water, and biological resources. Ecosystems would be damaged, biodiversity threatened, and radiation effects could continue into later generations. The narration then returns to a real image from Hiroshima, black rain. It says that dark, oily rain began falling about 20 minutes after the bomb was dropped, covering an area extending roughly 20 kilometers around the blast. The source describes that rain as intensely radioactive and capable of producing terrible changes in human blood. The point is not simply that the explosion kills. Nuclear war would keep acting after the flash through electricity, medicine, food, water, radiation, and the environment that survivors would still depend on. And even that would not be the final stage. The source describes dark smoke rising about 15 kilometers above Earth, and then being carried by winds until it could spread across the planet and obscure the sky. In the first years after a large nuclear exchange, the narration says humanity might not see a clear sky for as long as 30 years. With sunlight blocked, global temperatures would plunge. Agriculture would become difficult, summers could effectively disappear, animals would starve, and vegetables and other crops would wither. The first 5 years are described as especially dangerous because freezing conditions could repeatedly disrupt growing seasons. A period of recovery might eventually begin, but the source places a return toward normal temperatures roughly 25 years later. Even then, atmospheric processes could damage the ozone layer. It claims that a nuclear war using only 0.3% of the world's arsenal could destroy 50% of that protective layer, exposing Earth to far greater solar radiation. This is where the documentary returns to the image that began it. Einstein's warning was not really about primitive weapons. It was about the possibility that modern weapons could destroy the systems, climate, food, technology, and institutions that make modern civilization possible. In the source's final framing, a nuclear Third World War would not simply be another conflict. It could become a reversal of civilization itself, pushing humanity back toward sticks and stones and perhaps toward annihilation.